This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, what would Dr. Martin Luther King do? As debate continues over the expansion of another U.S. military operation in the Middle East, we turn to look at the final year of King's life, when he became a fierce critic of U.S. foreign policy in the Vietnam War, calling the United States, quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today.
We do not stop our war against the people of Vietnam immediately. The world will be left with no other alternative than to see this as some horrible, clumsy, and deadly game we have decided to play. The world now demands a maturity of America that we may not be able to achieve. It demands that we admit that we have been wrong from the beginning of our adventure in Vietnam, that we have been detrimental to the life of the Vietnamese people. The situation is one in which we must be ready to turn sharply from our present ways.
Dr. Martin Luther King speaking on April 4th, 1967 at Riverside Church in New York, explaining why he opposed the war in Vietnam. The speech was delivered exactly a year to the day before King was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th, 1968.
We're joined right now by public television and radio broadcaster Tavis Smiley. He has a new book out this week, Death of a King, the real story of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s final year. You can read its introduction and first chapter at democracynow.org. Tavis, welcome back to Democracy Now! What a week to come out with this book.
Amy and Juan, good to be back. First of all, thanks for the invitation. It is interesting, not just a week, but today as we sit here for this conversation on the 13th anniversary of 9/11, I have been thinking for the last 48 hours, and knowing that this day would come, what King would be saying on this particular day. And his heart would certainly bleed for those persons who lost, those fellow citizens who lost their lives in this great city 13 years ago, no doubt about that, because he abhorred violence anywhere in the world. He said many times that it's either nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. And so he was against violence anyway, which is why he came out against the war in Vietnam, because he was sitting at breakfast one day eating, and he was looking at a magazine and saw the pictures of these children in Vietnam who'd been napalmed to death, and he just stopped eating. And one of his aides says, "Doc, what's wrong? Does the food not taste good?" He says, "This food doesn't taste good, nor will anything else I ever eat if I don't commit myself to do something about the violence that's being perpetrated on these young children in Vietnam." So he was against violence here, he was against violence there, and I've often wondered what that bust of Martin King in the Oval Office must be whispering to President Obama late at night as he's making these kinds of plans. Because everybody quotes Martin. It's almost become pablum and platitude to quote him every time we have a public gathering. But to really wrestle with the subversiveness of his truth about that triple threat that he talked about, Amy, racism, poverty, and militarism. What did we see on display in Ferguson a few weeks ago? Racism, poverty, and militarism. And now here we are again on, what is the irony that on 9/11, the headline in every major paper in this country is that here we go again. And King would just be, he'd have some issues with that.
Well, we've often talked on this show about that last year of his life when he really became not so much a hero for the establishment of the country at that time, but you go behind the scenes talking about what it was for him, how he reached a decision first. You start the book right on just before his speech at Riverside Church, and then you go through that year. Could you talk about your decision to do that after all these other books that have come out about Dr. King in the past?
Glad you raised that one. It's always the first question. Why another book about Dr. King? Because this one has not been written before, to your point, that focuses just on that last year, April 4, 67, when he gives that speech, to April 4, 68, a year to the day later. And what happens to Martin in that last year? What kind of person is he really when all this hell and hate is being directed at him? So let me just say very quickly that this book isn't possible without the heavy lifting that's already been done by his three principal biographers, Taylor Branch, David Garrow, and Claiborne Carson. I thank them all the time because they've done the real work here. But no book has ever focused just on this last year, because for me, I think it's the case that whether you're talking Amy or Juan or Tavis or anybody else, any human being, we come to know who we really are in the most difficult and dark days of our lives. And for King, that happened to be the last year of his life. So if you think you know Dr. King and you don't know what happened to him in the last year, then you really don't know Martin, because to your question, Juan, what happens is when he comes out against that war and starts talking, Amy, about a poor people's campaign, as long as Martin was talking about civil rights, he was okay. But Negro, we didn't give you license to talk about foreign policy. We didn't give you license to talk about federal budget priorities. And Martin was saying that war is the enemy of the poor, that the bombs that you're dropping in Vietnam are landing in the ghettos and barrios of American cities. And for saying that, for being so vocal about that, what happens, Juan? The White House turns on him. He's worked with Lyndon Johnson to get the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act passed. But now Johnson is after him. So the White House turns on him, number one. The media turns on him. When you read, you all know this stuff. I feel like I'm telling you stuff you already know. But when you read what the New York, almost 50 years after his death, you read what the liberal New York Times said about him, what the liberal Washington Post said about him, what Time magazine said about him. It's embarrassing to read what they said about Martin when he came out against the war in Vietnam all these years later. So the media turns on him. First the White House, then the media, and I might add the black media turned on Martin King. And then white America turned on him. The last poll in his life, the Harris poll, found that nearly 3/4 of the American people, 75%, thought that Martin was irrelevant. Get this, Martin King dies with approval ratings or disapproval ratings about the same as George Bush when he left the White House. That's how bad his numbers were, believe it or not. So white America turns on him, and hold on to your hat, almost 60% of black folk in the country thought he was persona non grata. And so in his own lifetime, that last year, he really didn't have a constituency. He couldn't get his own organization, SCLC, to support him the way he wanted on the Poor People's Campaign. So everybody turns on him, and he has to navigate that until he dies.
And yet he stuck to his guns.
Oh,
or I don't actually want to use that analogy. They're sticking to his guns, but he was
truth.
adamant,
Exactly.
right?